Satan, 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 our Lord and Master, I acknowledge thee as my God and Prince. I promise to serve and obey thee as long as I shall live. I renounce the other God and all the saints. Don't listen to them! Don't listen to them!
Welcome back to the Ave Satanis podcast. My name is Jack Violently. I'll be your host today. The Ave Satanis podcast is a presentation of the Free Society Satanist. We are a worldwide collective of anarchistic Satanists under the banner of the Global Order of Satan. For more information and how to join us on Discord, check the links in the show notes below. We've also added a Support the Show tab in the show notes where you can directly donate to our fundraising efforts. All proceeds made from that tab will go to our fundraisers. So we have an extremely important episode for you guys today. It is going to be an information-dense episode, so strap in. And here to help me navigate the waters is my friend and yours, Cris. Cris, what's going on, dude?
It's going pretty good, man. It's a beautiful day out here in Georgia. So
it's a beautiful day to talk about Nazis, huh?
Sure it is.
So not only do we have you to help us here to keep us company, we are also joined by our very special guest, author of Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege, and also 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, Street Legal Tactics for Community Activists. When he isn't writing great books, he can be found traveling the world giving talks on far-right extremism, terrorism, and sometimes even Satanism. Tie into these worlds there. So if this didn't already make him a pretty cool dude, he has also spent the better part of 2 decades infiltrating, investigating, and bringing this dirt to the light of scrutiny. Spencer Sunshine, it is an honor, good sir. How are you today?
Thank you. I was listening to these intros and I go, this sounds like a really interesting guy. I should.
Who are they talking about?
We have a lot to talk about.
So it's wild. I found out about you we found out about you from Into the Stooniverse, the podcast that you just recently did. Queer Satanic posted about that and kind of brought it into our view. We basically hung out in the same backyard, just kind of minus 5 years. That's freaking crazy.
In Georgia. Are both of you from Georgia?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Yeah.
Both from kind of central Georgia.
Yeah.
Yep. So
well, I would say I was from North Georgia, but at least I wasn't from South Georgia. So
right. So as we joked about in the emails, I am from Milledgeville, Georgia, and you had kind of like made the same joke that I have heard most of my life. After high school and a little bit afterwards, I went into the military. So I was in the Navy in Great Lakes, Illinois. And part of boot camp was you had to stand up, sound off, and say where you're from. So I stood up and I was like, Recruit Jackson Division 206. Sir, I'm from Milledgeville, Georgia. And all the way in Illinois, the guy was like, are you crazy? And I was like, what do you mean? And it didn't dawn on me that he was making a mental, like a mental hospital joke. Milledgeville is known for...
is that where the...
Yeah.
Yep.
Milledgeville is known for the quote-unquote...
The state hospital.
The state hospital, yes. But so this episode here, during the inception of the Ave Satanis podcast, so I've always grown up a sharp skinhead. And I know Into the Stooniverse, you were kind of talking about like the different delineations of like skinhead culture. And we can go into it a little bit today if time permits. But everything that I've always known about skinhead culture was unity and inclusion. It wasn't until I started going to shows like in Atlanta where I started seeing the hateful side of it. And early on in the Ave Satanis podcast, I was talking to Cris about my love of oi music, my love of the sharp culture. And I was like, man, I wonder if there's satanic skinheads. And sure enough, my little thumbs went to Googling and I hated what I found. So this is theoretically because like I said, yeah. Sorry.
Did you find a group or did you find a band? Is it a band or a label?
It wasn't a band. We more found the Order of Nine Angles, and we also found more just kind of the groups that a satanic skinhead would find if they were searching those two words together. So that's kind of what...
There was a group in the 80s called the Satanic Skinheads. Gavin Baddeley says that, although I haven't found much information otherwise. So that's why I wasn't sure if you were referring to that specific group.
And I would probably imagine they're not the fun, all-inclusive satanic skinheads. They probably skew the other way.
I don't think they were sharp. I don't think they were sharp skins.
God dang it.
Yeah, and it's crazy because, like, I've been having this general idea for an episode like this for a long time, and I've worked and I've tried to research, and every time I got close to what I thought was going to be an outline of a script, I would always find something more, you know. I didn't realize how deeply all of this stuff goes. So when Queer Satanic did post about that podcast you're on, and I listened to it, I was like, holy crap. So I immediately went out and bought your book, and then all of a sudden we've got you on the show. So I'm really excited for this, and let's give Jack a break right quick for his migraine sakes, and just dive right into it if you don't mind.
Sure, let's do it.
So I guess my first question, and kind of to, you know, bring everybody into it, how was it that you first got into an interest of studying, you know, far-right politics, the neo-Nazis, and tangentially then the satanic side of things? How did all that work out for you?
Well, Georgia, of course. I grew up in Lawrenceville, Georgia, which was a small, in the 70s. It's sort of suburbs now. In the 70s, it was a small town, like maybe 10,000 people, between Athens and Atlanta. I always said, and maybe you stop there for gas, if that. In the 70s and 80s, they had a very picturesque courthouse, and there were Klan rallies there pretty periodically. I found out later there's an irony, is that the original courthouse was actually burned down by the first Klan to destroy the records in it. It was a very, very conservative area. The president, I started studying the John Birch Society later on, this far-right group that was established in the late 50s, like, you know, kind of anti-communists, swing nut anti-communists. And asked my dad, I was like, I'm familiar with all this stuff. Where is there Bircher literature in our community? And he's like, no. And then I learned that the president of the John Birch Society was our congressional representative. So it was this kind of place. And then it was in 1988 that the Nazi skinhead movement really exploded in the United States. And so I was in high school in 88, and I was in high school with all these Nazi skinheads. And I was in the punk scene, and we drive to Atlanta. And at the time, in the Atlanta metro area, there were like a dozen neo-Nazi groups, largely skinhead groups, some Klan groups. There was a major early neo-Nazi leaders who still lived, I think, in Marietta, who are in the National States Rights Party, Ed Fields and J.B. Stoner, who was a convicted church bomber, and they were networking with the skinheads. And so all of this kind of stuff. I ended up meeting up with an adult group of people doing grassroots counter-organizing against these people. It's always funny now because I think of them as these older adults, but they're younger than I am now. And they'd come into contact with me and some other punk rockers and skinheads, and sort of put us together. And so we formed an anti-racist, in the parlance then, kind of anti-fascist now, group inside the punk scene in Atlanta to push back against the Nazi domination. There were no other groups inside the punk scene. There were a lot of people who were not happy with it, but there was no other organized groups pushing back against it. So at the time, we were the only one. I don't know. I think we did have some success in letting people know that there was organized opposition. But so much later on, I got into left-wing activities, many years, did all kinds of stuff, we'll just say. In 2005, I was writing my dissertation, which is about the structure of post-1960 anarchist theory in the United States. And I was still looking at different factions, and I found this basically crypto-fascist group that was cross-recruiting, who were called National Anarchists. They were an outgrowth of the British National Front. And started looking at them, and then writing about them. I wrote a couple of articles about them, and then it sort of spiraled I got more and more interested in like anti-Semitism and these stranger forms of fascism and red-brown movements that combine the left and right. Eventually ended up working at a think tank when I was done with, I was a fellow at a think tank when I was done grad school. And then I went freelance and I've been doing this full time for the last 10 years. But another like 10 years before that, as part of other research and activism. So yeah, that's my weird trajectory. And
That's quite a story.
probably our age, it's very common for people to have gotten into the anti-fascist work through the conflict with Nazi skinheads or the presence of Nazi skinheads. And now it's a kind of esoteric thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for us, like I grew up in a small town in Georgia and we hated Nazi skins. Very normal thing in the 90s. Now people are like, oh, wow, that's a really weird background. I went to grad school and was studying the internet and, toxic politics and 4chan.
It's kind of wild because like me with the sharp upbringing, and I would go to shows at the Star Bar, Little 5 Points, but this was like 96, 97, where I think you probably got out of it around 91, 92, or probably left Atlanta about that time.
I left Atlanta and went to college in 92, early in 92.
So it's wild, like
91.
The kind of groups and circles that I probably ran with, you to some degree probably had a hand in kind of creating a bit. So,
well, I mean, I hope so. That would be nice. Were you there when Crime Think or the Proto Crime Think project had arisen?
I believe so. That was largely around the Little Five in the downtown scene, if I remember correctly. That was
Did you know Adolf and the Piss Artists?
That was a lot of beers ago. I'm trying to. That was a lot of Mickey's ago, and I apologize about that.
Oh, Mickey's! It's been a long time. Yeah, some of the people I worked with, I think most of the people I worked with stayed in the area for a while, and some of them still live there. Yeah, I mean, it's Georgia. A lot of people don't leave Georgia.
Right.
You said you joined the military. Again, a somewhat unusual thing, I think, for a lot of people. But in the South is a heavy military area. That is a very common thing, even for someone left-leaning to go join the military. And other people just never leave, right? Georgia really, like, a lot of people I went to high school with, even very liberal people, queer people, like, maybe they moved into Atlanta, but that was the extent of their, like, leaving the area.
Yeah, it was wild.
Not me. I GTFO'd as soon as I fucking could.
Well, I mean, when you're a 16, 17-year-old kid and you live in Milledgeville, Georgia, you're like, how am I going to get out of here? Like, it's a factory town. Like Grumman's there. So unless you're working at a factory, what are you going to do? So I looked at the military as kind of like my ticket out of here. Realized early on I'm not a yes sir, no sir kind of guy. So me and Uncle Sam butted heads quite a bit and got out sooner than I probably should have with my enlistment. But yeah, that was my way out of Milledgeville. It worked in the end, but it was there were easier ways to leave Milledgeville.
Yeah, you grew up in these small towns, I think especially in the South, and you can't, even though you could just move to another big city, you can't see the options. You don't know people who've done it. It's just not in your vision. I've realized that more as I've gotten older, that like, you have to put the options in front of people or they just go with what's around their community. Like you can't even think that you could go move if you were a young queer man. I mean, you couldn't be out in my community. It was super, super dangerous, that you couldn't just get up and move to San Francisco or New York, that it wasn't a big deal. You know what I mean? Like it just wasn't, that concept wasn't there. Even if you kind of knew there was a gay community in these places.
Yeah. And like, I grew up in kind of a Western Central Georgia small town. Right. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't venture into Atlanta for like concerts and stuff like that until around about 2002. Right. Mm-hmm. So my exposure to the racism comes from the Christian identity, right? Where, my grandfather was relatively high placed in the local KKK, also very involved with the Georgia militia, as was another important figure in my early childhood. So there was a bunch of talk about Ruby Ridge and Timothy McVeigh and all of that crowd. And breaking out of that was quite an endeavor. But when I started getting into like the music scene, I'm more into the industrial and death metal scenes. That's kind of my wheelhouse. And when I started getting into there, I started also seeing both sides of those, and we can talk about the countercultural neo-Nazi problem in the music scenes later, but it brought it all into really stark contrast. But I mean, I admit I still live in small town Georgia. It's got its own gravitational field somehow.
It does. It does. Well, I mean, Satan bless you. Sure, your presence is doing. Obviously, Titus, I'm sure your presence is doing good in that community. I mean, people are always like, "Oh, you should stay in these small communities and fight or whatever." And I'm like, "You should." I'm out of here.
It gets interesting when I wear the big Baphomet T-shirt to the local grocery store.
I bet.
I did purchase your book, the Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism book, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. Our listeners, please go out and buy the book. It is information dense. Yeah. I do have to say,
it took me 5 years to write it.
Yeah, and it shows. It's a well written book that lays out everything in the way I think it should be. And I admit I have not gotten through most of the first part, but I have reread the latter parts about neo-Nazi Satanism several times. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to try to get into some of that if we can, perhaps a little bit of a high level overview about where modern Satanism and far-right politics kind of came in with each other. I think it's a well-known fact at this point that Anton LaVey famously lifted major parts of the Satanic Bible from Ragnar Redbeard's Midas Right. But there's other ties as well in there that, I gleaned from your book and had already known from other research. Things like James Mason's Siege, James Madol and the National Renaissance Party and things like that. So perhaps we could get if you can, just a high level overview of how all of those things kind of tied in.
Sure, I'll do my best, and I'll just plug now for the future. I wrote a much longer article. It's called A Short History of Nazi Satanism for the Journal of Right Wing Studies. It's being reviewed right now. Hopefully it'll be out at the end of the year or early next year. I'll put it on my social media when it comes out. And I've been giving talks based on this. So if you're in a Satanist or other left-hand path group and you'd like me to give a talk to your group over video, unless you want to bring me there and pay for the transit, I'm willing to do that, because I'm trying to talk to Satanists in particular, because at this point we all see that there are Nazi skinheads, or you all see. I'm on the edges of that scene. People can see that they're there. It's well known that they're there with O9A or Order of Nine Angles and some other groups, but a lot of people don't, and I had to reconstruct it, see that this is a current, and almost a current within Satanism that's been there since very near the beginning. So in writing this article, I read every academic book on Satanism. There's about 10 of them, and most of them downplay this as well. So I think I really want to upplay it, not because it's a major current, it's a minor current, although a very visible one within Satanists in general, but it's an important one. So everybody agrees there are precursors. If people are interested in this, about modern Satanism, there's like a literary movement in the 1800s, and then there's a few groups that sort of arise and fall. They're local groups in the late early 1900s. But modern Satanism begins with Anton LaVey's establishment of the Church of Satan in 1966 in San Francisco, and he writes the Satanic Bible in 1969. The Satanic Bible, the part of it is directly plagiarized from Ragnar Redbeard's Midas Right. LaVey talks about this in the introduction to Shane Bugby's edition of Midas Right, which he wrote in late 96, right before his death. LaVey dies in 97. And so this is an ugly social Darwinist text. Nature's red in tooth and claw, but also it's this old school white supremacism from the late 1800s. It's really misogynistic. There's classical anti-Semitism, like the Jews control everything in the media, blah, blah, blah. Something that certain people like Lucian Greaves have a hard time getting their head around, that this is classic anti-Semitism. So this is already in there in the individualist thrust of this. He's an atheist Satanist, right? Are you guys atheists or theists?
We're atheistic mostly.
You're an
Yes.
atheistic Satanist?
Non-theistic
Okay, I
Satanists.
assume, but just checking. Were you in TST, or did you come by this honestly?
We came from another group that will not be named. A large part of us came from TST, though, myself not included. But basically, everybody else kind of had their toes in TST to some degree. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the Satanist Church of Satan is atheist Satanists. They're highly individualistic, typical for Satanists. Not all of them, I think. Especially as we get into these left-wing anti-fascist Satanists lately. People are moving away from the hardcore individual libertarian-style individualism. LaVey in the Satanic Bible specifically welcomes LGBTQ people. He's specific about it, as well as says that Satanism has no racial component or class component. It's not one thing. Now, very quickly, internally, the church is not like that. People are reporting that people, like, they go to rituals and people are dressed in Klan and Nazi uniforms and they're told it's a joke. And then they talk to them. I think Ian Bonewitz is the guy who wrote about this. Talk to them privately, and they weren't joking at all. Around the mid 70s, Michael Aquino, who writes his History of the Church of Satan, he splits from from LaVey in 75 to form the Temple of Set, another important theistic Satanist group. Finds that some Church of Satan people have formed and joined a Nazi Satanist group called the Order of the Black Ram in Detroit. And he brings this up with LaVey. He says, what the fuck? And he has a discussion, and LaVey reveals that he has been in contact with a guy named James Madole, who led an occult fascist group. He's sort of a crypto-Nazi. They didn't use like swastikas in public and such, but he was a National Socialist who was interested in a bunch of different occult forms, but also in Satanism. And LaVey had been in contact with Madole, and the Madole even gave him a membership card. I think this was like an honorary card, but LaVey kept it. And LaVey said it's fine if neo-Nazis are in the church. And also in this passage in Aquino's book is overlooked that the church created a reciprocal relationship with the Order of the Black Ram, recognized them as like a brother Satanist group, which they rarely did with other groups. And it was because this group acknowledged that their ideas were based on LaVey and gave him credit. At the same time, around 1973, it's a little unclear, but some scholars point to this. In Britain, the Order of the Nine Angles is developed by David Myatt. The origins of the group are really shrouded in sort of mystery. Even Myatt has claimed he's not the known founder, Anton Long, although everyone pretty much agrees he is. And he was a neo-Nazi starting in the late 60s, a really militant neo-Nazi. And so he founds this, depending on who you ask, version of Nazi Satanism in 73. So it's right at this period. It's interesting that we see this less than 10 years after modern Satanism is initiated, that we have full-on Nazi Satanists. I should also say Church of Satan and probably other groups use a lot of Nazi imagery separately. There's the whole social Darwinist thing. LaVey starts to talk about there being a satanic master race that's genetic, and it believes in a hierarchical society, is very focused on eugenics, which is a very strange. It doesn't really make any sense to me about why a highly individualistic doctrine would be interested in eugenics, especially one. But whatever, they think they're the elite of this new hierarchy. He starts talking about how later on, if fascism makes men look like men and women look like women, then he's all for it. Which becomes a far cry from the Satanic Bible, where he's like, queer people are welcome into it. So Aquino, as I said, splits off in 75, forms a major group called the Temple of Set. He has an unhealthy fascination with the Nazis, even though they say they're not a neo-Nazi group. There are some people who are involved in fascist politics who are hanging around it, like Harry Bolton and Nicholas Schreck and Zena LaVey, Anton's daughter, who broke with him. Aquino does stuff like on his recommended reading list about World War II, says you should read. He's got a pro-Nazi, neutral, and anti-Nazi historians, and the neutral one is David Irving, who is a Holocaust denier. So you can see where he's kind of coming from. There's all kinds of weird stuff like this. That's
quite the curve.
Yeah, man. So he goes to the Wewelsburg Castle, which was Himmler's castle. If you've seen the Black Sun images all the Nazis use, it's like a marble inlay in the castle. and does a working there, and this becomes an important church document or a temple document. So there's all kinds of weird stuff going on. They eventually have to purge Order of Nine Angles members in the early 90s. I found this reading. I even told an ex-Temple of Set person this. In 92, they have to purge O9A people because the problem had gotten out of hand. So this is in 75. He starts to do this. A lot of Satanist groups have broken off the church or been inspired by the church now. People are interpreting it in different directions. When the Satanic Panic happens in the 80s, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with this. It's interesting because it ends up coinciding with the Nazi skinhead thing in the States. It starts earlier in Britain. It comes to the States. The first group's 85, but the first national group's 87, and only explodes in 88. So we have Nazi skinheads running alongside the Satanic Panic, and there becomes some crossover, as there must be some level of crossover between these sort of very anti-mainstream society traditions. It's at this point that we get, or a little earlier, the involvement of Church of Satan members with the Abraxas Foundation and James Mason. So James Mason is today's preeminent neo-Nazi terrorist ideologue. He wrote a book called Siege, which I wrote a book. It's technically about Siege, but it's really about the people around Mason. It's about Mason, but it's about 70s neo-Nazism, and it's about this group of people I'll talk about. In 1986, they contact Mason. It ends up being 4 people. It's the industrial musician Boyd Rice, well known for accusations of being a neo-Nazi, but with limited evidence previously. That concrete but limited evidence. He's always poo-pooed and says he's being smeared. Adam Parfrey, who ran a very important underground press called Feral House, who sold hundreds of thousands of books. His books have been made into movies. Published within this neo-Nazis and white supremacists, always poo-pooed again, said he was just investigating extremes or exposing them for their ideas. And Nicholas Schreck, who was a Satanist, also a musician in a band called Radio Werewolf, married Zena LaVey's daughter. Anton LaVey's daughter, Zena. And then eventually Michael Moynihan, who was an industrial musician who moved to playing neofolk under the name Blood Axis, and he ended up becoming the most important figure in this. So basically, Boyd Rice was fascinated by Charles Manson and Adolf Hitler. He got this fascination, I think, through, or Kevin Coogan says, through Genesis P-Org of the industrial band Throbbing Gristle, who he's close with. Rice opened the last Throbbing Gristle gig in England.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and then they played 2 in the United States. And a friend of mine who was in the early punk scene in the Bay Area was like, "Oh, I saw Throbbing Gristle," and I was like, "Dude, that was their last show." And he's like, "Yeah, okay, I don't know."
Wow.
I think Flipper opened the last show until they got back together. So Rice contacts Mason. He introduces him to both Adam Parfrey and then Michael Moynihan. But what happens is that Rice joins the Church of Satan the next year in 1987, becomes very close to Anton LaVey, ends up going all the way up the food chain to the Council of Nine, which is the advisory body. So he's a priest, and then Council of Nine is an advisory body to Anton LaVey. Michael Moynihan joins the group as a member and eventually becomes a priest. He also introduces LaVey to Thomas Thorne, a musician who was in My Life with the Thrill Cult and then founded the Electric Hellfire Club. Also later on, but also made a member by LaVey in person. Schreck is made a member. He's hanging out with Xena. He's made a member, and then he's a Satanist. He said, I interviewed him recently. He said after the book came out, he says he's a theistic Satanist. And him and Xena Xena and Rice would all go during the Satanic Panic and represent the church in public. Xena was the official church spokesperson. And then Anton LaVey also introduced to Anton LaVey. See, my words go in different directions. Adam Parfrey, the Feral House publisher, also meets LaVey and becomes his main publisher. After a certain point, he publishes all of, I think, starting in 89, he publishes all of LaVey's books. The new one, Satanic Bible, stays in press on a major press, stays in print on a major press, and he publishes 2 or 3 of LaVey's books, and then Blanche Barton's autobiography.
So I got a question for you. You had mentioned My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult and the Electric Hellfire Club. Yep. They were kind of in the shitty side of things here?
Well, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, not so much. They used a lot of satanic imagery,
Okay.
but I asked them about this. There was for one tour, Thomas Thorne joined them. Now, Thorne had been in a band called Slave State, who looked every bit of a neo-Nazi band. I
Yeah.
mean, like really, and they were like, "Oh, we're kind of just joking," but like, were they joking at the time? And if they were, they weren't later,
Yeah.
because Thorne became close to James Mason. And in fact, on one of their EPs, they thank Mason. They reprint this stuff by James Mason that Mason had published about Charles Manson. They title a song after a line from James Mason, "The Night of the Buck Knives." So Thorne's tight with him. And then he forms the Electric Hellfire Club, and this is his vehicle. It's his band. I actually saw Rice and Electric Hellfire Club once in Albuquerque, and it was such a weird billing because Electric Hellfire Club are this sort of more dancey, sleazy, sexy band, and Rice was playing just like atonal, loud, noisy industrial music. It was very strange, but now I realize they were friends, and they're both friends with James Mason.
Yeah, I had come
So
across.
these guys,
Oh, sorry.
don't go.
I had come across the Electric Hellfire Club, just like, Spotify will recommend you more bands. If you like this, check this out. And I've been a fan of like Ministry, and I liked My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, and they just came up like tangentially in my music search, and I was like, they had a song called I forget the name of it. He just basically chants hell. It's like, hell, hell, hell. And I'm like, man, that's catchy enough. It's kind of poppy and dancey in that early 80s, like mid 80s way. And so to hear like now, I'm not a big fan of Electric Hellfire Club, but it's just weird that like hearing them and now knowing the backstory just kind of makes it real fucking creepy.
It does. I liked Electric Hellfire Club. They were like a Cleopatra band. That was the big goth label.
Yeah.
So basically, these guys contact Mason. Mason's ideas are that he had gone through all these neo-Nazi groups in the 70s as they splintered into smaller and smaller groups, so it became a party of one, cranking out this newsletter in his basement that was literally mimeographed and never made more than 100 copies. And he advocated random attacks, single actor attacks, serial killings, massacres, civil unrest. And he said, if people are going to go do these things, don't just get angry and go shoot some people up. Do it very publicly and with a lot of panache, very stylistically. And this became very influential later on. Mason ended up being the main inspiration for this wave of neo-Nazi terrorist groups we've seen in the last 10 years, starting with the Atomwaffen Division, and it splintered into other groups like the Feuerkrieg Division and the Zonnenkrieg Division and the Bays he influenced. And then eventually this shifting set of Telegram channels to Telegram, and now into this weird combination. We can talk about this. The FBI created a term for it called NVE, Nihilistic Violent Extremism, which is a mix of Order of Nine Angles Satanists, neo-Nazi accelerationists, this name for these people advocating terrorism, 764, a child abuse cult, and people fetishizing and encouraging school shooters. And it's all become mixed together. And so this is part of the legacy of James Mason and why he's important. So we're seeing all these Church of Satan people around Mason working with him. They spend like 9 years trying to sell him to the underground, putting him, for the first time outside of his little cloistered neo-Nazi circles in, these underground magazines, and then a book. He's in the famous anthology Apocalypse Culture, still in print, meaning that Feral House is still making money off of James Mason. Some documentaries. Nicholas Schreck put him in the movie Charles Manson Superstar. And then eventually Michael Moynihan edits all these newsletters that Mason had published in the 80s into this book Siege, which comes out in 93 eventually. So these people are all in the Church of Satan. LeVague basically gives his blessing to the book. And Gilmore is really excited too. Peter Gilmore is the future head of the Church of Satan. He's publishing the official periodical called The Black Flame, the church publication. And he promotes Siege in Black Flame. He's writing these fawning letters to both Moynihan and James Mason about how much he likes their work. There's a glowing review in The Black Flame. I mean, what does a neo-Nazi book advocating terrorism have to do with Satanism? At the time, there's also a debate inside the Church of Satan because the presence of neo-Nazis, these guys and others, has become very visible about if Satanism and fascism are compatible. And these arguments are printed in Black Flame. I helped digitize all the issues of Black Flame. They're available online, probably through Queer Satanic. I know they've put them up in some places. I found that the early ones, which were not available, I had to get them from an archive. We're in the process of trying to dig through the early Church of Satan stuff, and make it, they've kind of made it unavailable of their early publications and such, to see how they developed over the years politically. And they start reviewing, Gilmore's publication starts reviewing other fascist stuff and fascist stuff, until it ends around 96, I think it ends. So you'll find all these reviews. There's stuff like, Jared Taylor, who's this racist intellectual, being reviewed, and you're like, what does Jared Taylor have to do with Satanism at all? I mean, LaVey had moved to the right, and Gilmore is just like this far right dude. I mean, if you read his books, he just sounds like some like cranky old boomer listening to Fox. I mean, so all these Church of Satan people are involved in this creation of this neo-Nazi terrorist book, and the church has given its blessing to it. LaVey, after the first edition comes out, sends James Mason a signed copy of the Satanic Bible. James Mason goes and visits Peter Gilmore when he's in New York City. They take pictures together. So that it's a very close relationship. And then these guys all remain in the Church of Satan these other people remain in the church a long time, except Nicholas Schreck, who splits out. So it's interesting because atheist Satanism is tied to neo-Nazi terrorism at this point, and then later it becomes theistic Satanism. So the Order of Nine Angles is in Britain. They produce a huge amount of theological documents. They have these elaborate views. Basically, they're very heathen influenced, and they say that we live in a essentially heathen European society. Is essentially like pagan, but it's been perverted by the supposed Jewish conspiracy, which has affected all of our social and political world. We have to engage in these heretical acts to somehow burst that Jewish controlled world, and then to move us into the next stage of humanity. There's weird stuff like people are going to go in and colonize space. Like I can't even get into the different things. They also advocate murdering people under the name culling, and doing something called taking an insight role, which is where you're supposed to join an extremist movement the opposite of your beliefs, usually Islamism or neo-Nazism, as a kind of weird, bizarre self-help growth project. But what we found, and this is important recently, is that neo-Nazis become Nazi Satanists.
Yeah.
So, and this is what's happening a lot. There's other groups like the Joy of Satan, which we can talk about. I know you have an interest in them. The whole Nazi Satanist thing is very contentious, though. A lot of neo-Nazis hate it. A lot of Satanists don't like it. At one point in the 80s, there's a crossover between heathens and Satanists. And everybody hates everybody in this. Like, people start being kicked out of groups like Stephen Edward Flowers, who's a famous translator, gets kicked out of his heathen group for being a member of the Temple of Set, for example. So it's a very schismatic current within Satanism.
That's the thing that really struck me, especially reading in your book. There's not very many degrees of separation between neo-Nazi Satanism, far-right politics, and even the Christian identity and the Christian nationalist side of things going on right now in America. Like, I recognized quite a few names in your book that I connected to the Christian identity and the Christian nationalist side of things. And I think it was
it's like Miles and Butler.
Yeah, and wasn't it Moynihan that had done a review on a Dinesh D'Souza thing, and then
there's a review in the Black Flame of it.
And then Trump recently pardoned Dinesh D'Souza. Like, that's a
terrible human being.
Yeah, like it's they're so closely aligned, and I think it's funny, but also hair raising that there is so much animosity between the two, but they're so connected. I found that to be very interesting. Have you noticed like any other like connections kind of like that? Perhaps
with other movements, or which?
Yeah, maybe with other movements, but maybe somebody running I wouldn't necessarily say as an intermediary between like the Nazi Satanism side and the Christian nationalist side. Maybe somebody that our listening public may know in media or something that have connections between the two.
They tend to hate each other, but and this actually is a point of conflict inside of neo-Nazism. James Mason, though, is working with all these people in the Church of Satan, and he converts to Christianity, and is still in contact with them. So this would be a point. He at one point writes to Swift's Reverend Swift, the main, probably the largest Christian identity figure in the U.S., to his widow, as he's developing this his own strange brand of UFO, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi Christianity. Based in part by Eric von Däniken's Chariot of the Gods. I went to find this book about how the Bible is really, all these ancient cultures are really like have knowledge of the aliens coming, or the aliens came, and the Bible describes an alien spaceship or whatever. I went back and read it. I always heard about it. I actually looked around in used bookstores till I could find a little yellowing paperback that was specifically what I wanted for $2, until I actually found it in this little town in the South, of course.
That's crazy.
Of course. Yeah. Go read Däniken, and then
I actually, the thing is, I have read Charity of the Gods. That was a piece of literature that was in my house as a child.
Yeah.
Wow.
It used to be a really big book, which is strange. I mean, I saw it in like all these Christian stores, but in the South, a lot of Christians were into some really odd stuff. It was like you had to be a Christian in most communities, and so you went through that even if your actual interest was something else. If you weren't in that, you had to justify it in some way as a Christian.
Wow.
So no, but I think people switch between them. I mean, spiritual people will often go through a Satanist period and then go into Christianity, or go through a Christian period or whatever. That's not uncommon. If you're a spiritual person, you'll often explore different, if you're an untraditional spiritual person, you'll often explore different spiritual traditions. So like Terry Bolton, a very important Nazi fascist occult writer in New Zealand, went through Satanist periods, has, I think, ended up as a Christian more recently. He's been around for decades. So, I mean, one goes through these things. And there's an Order of Nine Angle guy in Eastern Europe who was ONA and then became some sort of like priest, I think, eventually in a Eastern Orthodox church. And there's a real question about whether he's doing an insight role, or if he changed his views, or if somehow, there become these dualistic Christians, Gnostic style Christians, which embrace like the good and evil in the world. And so there can be a combination. The Process Church is this famous group, sometimes considered a Satanist group in the U.S., founded in the 60s, and they have elements of both. They're not Satanists, but they do have elements of both. So
and that's the thing. I always find it so suspect when somebody goes from quote unquote one extreme to the other. Because, especially during the Satanic Panic, you had multiple people that claimed to be like a satanic priest turned to Christian and pushing the Satanic Panic crap. There was a famous like VHS tape called The Prophecy Club, where the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but he claimed to be like an ex-satanic priest. And then all of a sudden he was talking about how Magic the Gathering was a portal to the devil. It's on YouTube. If you want to find it, it is, looking at it through those eyes, hilarious. But
was he also the guy who said that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle action figures were satanic as well? Was he the guy basically just going through his kid's toy box and just pulling out shit and saying this is satanic because, and then giving some random ass like explanation for it? Was that dude?
Probably. Yeah. I wish I could remember his name. I'm not going to look it up right now. But so you talked a bit about O9A. That would, as far as the common, quote unquote, common knowledge of like problematic Satanism, let's call it, that's probably like the largest group that people know. The Church of Satan does a lot of legwork every day to cover up a lot of their very problematic parts. But online, especially, if somebody is getting approached by the idea of far-right Satanism, ONA, it usually enters the topic. Like, I know that there's been a couple of instances where ONA members or affiliates have perpetrated violent acts or attempted to. Ethan Melzer being one of them. I'm sure you're familiar with him. As I understand it, maybe you can provide some more context. Ethan Melzer was a U.S. serviceman that was arrested, and he pleaded guilty in 2003 to 3 counts, aiding, abetting the attempt to murder U.S. service members. From what I understand, he was basically trying to give information to set up an ambush on his unit. So I know there's others. Do you have any information on others? Like people can maybe look up and see what they've done or whatever?
Sure. So briefly talk about O9A and its importance today. It was, as I said, it was established by this neo-Nazi, like violent neo-Nazi. They were super obscure. Like people said they had 1 or 2 members, like through until like the aughts. Often scholars say this. David Myatt, the founder, got attention in England because in 1999, someone he was tied to was a nail bomber in London and killed 3 people and injured like 150.
Mm.
More, and they got rediscovered with when Atomwaffen forms around 2015. They people had been starting to promote them, in particular Nexian, what they call their local groups, run by a guy named Joseph Caleb Sutter, who was a neo-Nazi, founded the Temple of Blood. And the Temple of Blood became tied to this new wave of neo-Nazi accelerationism, in particular the Atomwaffen division. Funnily, it turned out that Sutter was a FBI informant, but he took all this FBI money and promoted his doctrines, which have spread throughout the world. So he's really playing both sides. And there are now, so what's happened as this neo-Nazi accelerationist tendency has grown and morphed, it's very deeply tied to the Order of Nine Angles. When these guys get arrested, there's dozens and dozens of arrests. And like Atomwaffen itself was tied to 5 murders. It's really hard to tell who is actually an Order of Nine Angles member and who isn't, because you got about a 50-50 chance, right? And
Yeah.
so you were talking about Meltzer. So I'm just going to say, I was like trying to track some of the stuff and I just got overwhelmed. There's a Wikipedia entry about violence by Order of Nine Angles members, and it is really, really long. There are murders by some O9A people who are not neo-Nazis, or, I mean, I think the doctrine is, but they themselves don't see it that way. They've committed a number of murders, separate. A lot of people who are neo-Nazis have been arrested for like child abuse and terrorism charges and all kinds of stuff. Dozens and dozens and dozens of people. Meltzer was in the army. As you said, he was trying to arrange a massacre, an ambush of his own unit, which is a pretty sinister thing. I mean, sometimes I'm like, if you're going to be a Satanist, like, go all the way, right? So, I mean, don't go all the way, but
he didn't pull half measures. I'll give him that, but nothing else.
Yeah, he was trying to send the information to Al Qaeda, who was, of course, like an FBI agent. So he was also tied to neo-Nazi circles, to Rapewaffen, this you might guess, super misogynistic offshoot of this accelerationist milieu. There was a guy who did a somewhat similar thing, arrested the year before in 2019, a private in the Army, Jarrett William Smith. He was tied to the Feuerkrieg division, another member of these groups. He was passing around bomb-making information. He was going to go attack Antifa members or people he thought were, I think, in Georgia. I don't remember. Or maybe that was, so there's so many of these guys, it's hard to remember who was attacking who or wanted to attack who. And so, as I said, there are many, many more ones, like the Atomwaffen Division's founder. The second leader was deeply tied to Order of Nine Angles. It became common inside the organization, and again created splits inside of it because Christian identity people wanted nothing to do with that. And after Atomwaffen folded and there were splinter groups, the splinter groups would split with each other over it. So there's groups that came out like the Satanic Front, who are supposedly part of the order, the original Temple of Blood, Nexion, as well as the National Socialist Order of Nine Angles, who are explicitly Satanist group. And they pop up and down. It's so hard to see whether they're existing or not. Or what's a group these days? It can just be like a Telegram group, right?
Yeah.
People don't meet. Like how do you give somebody a name and a title and they're invited to your loop or whatever, right?
Yeah. So and I think that's what's like so insidious about it, because they don't have a centralization. They don't have they're very transient, especially online. It's hard to nail everything down, and I think that's what made, like, when I was trying to research to do my own episode about this, it made it so difficult to nail down exactly what I wanted to talk about.
Right, and they even flip through platforms, so they might be like on Twitter, Telegram, Discus, like Roblox, like they're not even in one place often. You find that some people are arrested, and so tracking them can be, I mean, you have to spend as much of your life as they are to really like track them sometimes, right? Like, it can become overwhelming.
One of the things that I did read about ONA is like they really try to focus on the militaristic training aspect. And I have to imagine a large part of that is about OPSEC, to make themselves so difficult to track down and to pinpoint. Would you think so?
Well, there isn't a central point of O9A anymore, right? So, like, who is O9A? Anyone who declares themselves to be O9A, right? Individuals can have a local group. It becomes hard to tell who's just using some of the imagery and who isn't. Which doesn't mean that if they're using some of the imagery, they're not influenced by some of the ideas. But then you get a question of how committed people are. Like, there's a new group called the Maniac Murder Cult, MYK, which is the Cyrillic, because they're Eastern European in origin. And they basically are just trying to get people to commit violent attacks, and often record them and put them online, which really does seem to be like the dumbest OPSEC thing you could possibly think of, right?
Yeah, true.
And they're involved in O9A, but there generally is a agreement that their adherence to these ideas are pretty thin. But everybody ends up in the same place. If you're just committing random violence because you're a neo-Nazi accelerationist, because you're an Order of Nine Angles person, or wanting to commit like heretical actions because you just want to do a school shooting, because you just want to like be the ultimate nihilist, you end up doing the same things, right? And they all sort of combine together. So it's very difficult to pick these people out, with O9A now being very decentralized off of Myatt and the other people creating canonical documents. Anyone can do it. They are making jokes in their stuff too. Other people are making jokes. It's hard to tell who's serious or not, which doctrines are really ones you should follow or not. There's contradictory things. So it's all over the place. Everyone faces this problem now if you're dealing with really toxic actors, of like, how do you nail them down as they hop platforms and are and they're using every niche they can to go recruit. This is a very common thing amongst neo-Nazis. Like, they're very young, tend to be young and tech savvy, internet savvy, and they're like looking for anywhere they can get their claws in. As we say, Nazis ruin everything. They get into every fucking subculture. They get into every religious current. They get into tabletop gaming. You can't, anything you want, there's Nazis there. And I also want to say, for listeners, I don't know if you have non-Satanist listeners or whatever, like,
we probably do.
Okay, well, it's not surprising, and it shouldn't be a shock that there are Nazi Satanists, right? It would be more of a shock if there weren't, because you can find these fucking people in everything. Heathens have a much bigger problem with this than Satanists do. I mean, Satanists do have an ongoing problem, but heathens have a bigger problem. Christians, as you mentioned, there's Christian identity. They can be found in everything. So we shouldn't think, you should be vigilant. Satanists should be vigilant, especially, I would say, because that current goes back so far. I mean, we're at 50 years from 1975, right? And Satanism is only less than 60 years old, modern Satanism. So it's a permanent thing there. But it's in all other kinds of parts of our society, too. We've had National Socialism has been around for over 100 years now. Right?
Absolutely.
1919, I think, is when Hitler joined the German Workers' Party. The first group in the U.S. was, I think, 1922. So this is a permanent political strain in our societies and Western societies, and we need to be aware of this. We need to be aware these people are in the different places we'll be, and I think particularly in these non-mainstream religions and subcultures and milieus and stuff, like they will be there, and we need to just be aware of that and take countermeasures against them.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I am on Reddit. I'm barely on any other social media except for like Blue Sky now. But in the R Satanism subreddit, the TST subreddits, I've actually been reached out to via PM on a couple of different occasions by people with brand new accounts pushing Joyous Satan Ministries links and literature. So if you're in these spaces, it is something to be aware of, and trying not to fall into that, because if it's anything that I've noticed, people with those particular views are very good at social media and social engineering people into those views.
Yeah, a lot of people, Joy of Satan is very good at outreach. A lot of people say it's the first group they go through, this theistic Satanist group. They produce a lot of introductory materials, which I think a lot of groups kind of skip over. And yeah, they seem to want to proselytize. Their leader, the founder, Maxine Dietrich, was married to the emeritus leader of what at the time in the 90s was the biggest neo-Nazi party in the United States. This caused big schisms inside both the Joy of Satan and the party, the National Socialist Movement. So yeah, I mean, they'll be around. I'm sure people will come doing their recruiting pitches. Nazis and other modern white supremacists are very good about and very focused on proselytization.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people are still young. There are a fair amount of very young people involved in Satanism. The demographics changed a lot. I'm sure you guys could see it. It used to be like young teenagers. Originally, it was like in the 60s, it was a swinging 60s. It was like guys in their 30s, almost all men.
Mm-hmm.
And the Satanic Panic, it ended up being a lot of very young teenage, boys, men, male teenagers. And then now, especially with TST, we have a lot of people, more of all ages, a lot of, more people in the 20s to 40s or 50s or whatever, a lot more feminists and queer people and trans people. As much as TST has problems, I think they've done a great service in changing the demographics and the political temperature of modern Satanism, right? It has brought a lot more and a lot of different kinds of people into it. And that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
So, you were talking about like the Joy of Satan and these people were reaching out to you online, and, how would we, two questions here. Number one, how do you defend against it? Or also like, do you have any advice for people within satanic spaces who are getting into Satanism, but maybe don't know where to look originally, and then they kind of stumble upon these people, like honestly or whatever? Do you have any advice for people to how to navigate their search for satanic spaces, and also how do you defend against it once you are in and you are getting hit up by groups that you traditionally wouldn't want to be associated with?
Right. Well, in general, I wrote a guide called 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, Street Legal Tactics for Community Activists. It's available on my website, which is spencersunshine.com. There's printable PDFs and online stuff. It's in other languages if you want to read it in Spanish and German. There's a special Canadian version. And this gives some of the general, it's more about IRL organizing, but some of the general stuff. And the first thing there is, as I say, is to learn about the far right. Know about the groups and know about the symbols and stuff. And Satanists should do that with Nazi Satanists.
Right.
Kind of first, I don't say the first thing that you do, but you should do that because it'll help you recognize them and help you recognize talking points and symbols and other kinds of things. Where you should look and how you should respond. I'm going to throw this back to you guys because, I'm not that deeply involved in Satanist circles, but it has always been our philosophy, especially coming out of this punk and adjacent skinhead and goth and industrial. At Georgia, we were multi-subculturalists, I always say.
Yep.
So people go, are you a goth or blah, blah, blah? I'm like, a little bit of everything, There's cool things in all kinds of different subcultures, I think. Our philosophy has always been, because we deal with people with a lot of different subcultures and even Christians and other mainstream people, that you all know the best.
Yeah.
That you two, just you two, people like you are gonna know the niche the best, the language the best, their recruiting strategies the best, the symbols the best. And it's people like me. It's our job to support you because you're in the ideal place. Like I couldn't tell you what the best place to move for a non-fascist introductory materials are, their exact recruiting pitches at this moment.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna throw that back to you. Like you should be the ones because you're in it, right? I'm not in it. to be able to answer these questions more directly. Because also I couldn't answer for every niche thing, right?
And I would say
that's just not possible for me.
We were in a group a while back, once again, name redacted, who would throw up Ben Shapiro articles just for thought process, and then Jordan Peterson articles just to get the conversation started. And both Cris and myself, like, kind of independently of each other, were sending messages back and forth going, what the fuck's going on here? Like, what are we looking at right now? Once again, name redacted. We're not going to, it's not that type of show. But once I started seeing Ben Shapiro articles just for thought exercises, I'm like,
yeah, there was a lot of the quote unquote devil's advocate type of talk. And I see that across a lot of satanic spaces.
Yeah.
I would say, like, in our 9 principles, we specifically say we do not proselytize. If somebody has questions, we're going to answer them, but we don't, this podcast is pretty much the limit of our outreach, I suppose. We do have a website. All of that's in the show notes. I'm just going to go ahead and plug that one.
Go ahead and proselytize. Go ahead. Yeah.
But as far as like the times that I've been approached by Joy of Satan propaganda stuff, introductory stuff, I immediately take a screenshot of that, like in Discord, and post a thread in whatever subreddit I was in, whether it be Our Satanism, which is ostensibly the Church of Satan's subreddit, or the TST subreddit, or any of the other Satan adjacent subreddits. I'll post a link to like the message I got, and then put in about what Joy of Satan is or whatever, and put it in the most negative light that I possibly can, so that maybe the right person at some point in time gets their eyes on that post that I made, clues in, so that, oh, okay, I think that's probably one of the better ways, is sharing what we know in the same spaces where other people who might just be first getting into it or interested in it can be exposed to that, right? And I see the same in, like, with the Christian nationalists, the hard far right. There's stepping stones. Nobody goes from 0 to 100, right? So when the Norse revisionism started a few years back, I started seeing a bunch of people start getting into like the stepping stones towards the far right Norse heathenism stuff. And, I would try to talk to them and say, hey, look, this is like the Black Sun is a made up rune. Here's where it comes from, So I think that's probably one of the better ways that we as Satanists can help to dissuade that type of thinking. But dissuade is probably not the right word, but to stop in the tracks.
To steer. Steer it away from.
Right.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I talk about this in 40 Ways because we don't debate Nazis. We have a no platform perspective. But that doesn't mean we won't put somewhere online information rebutting what they're saying.
Right.
Because we do want people, as they're becoming exposed to this propaganda, or maybe sort of playing with entering the movement, like, they can be convinced away from it. They're like, oh, well, I'm not a Nazi, but I agree white people are discriminated against or whatever. But they're still in a fluid space, right? And it's good. I think you're doing absolutely the right thing to expose this stuff and critique it, and show the alternatives, show what's going on, and try to push people towards positive places you should go. I really like the Satan Not Hating campaign of the Global Order of Satan. It's important to have a presence. Even having an anti-racist presence informs people that there are racists. Because if there weren't racists, you wouldn't need an anti-racist presence, right?
Absolutely.
Like, that's always how you can tell. Sometimes we'd be looking at if there was, I think, at one point before Trump, looking at if there was Nazi infiltration in the vegan scene, and we saw so many vegan anti-fascists that we knew there were vegan fascists, right?
Yeah.
You could tell by the opposite. So
that is a good litmus test. I hadn't thought about it that way. Mm-hmm. That is a really interesting way to see other groups, like perhaps the listener who happened upon this episode isn't even interested in Satanism. maybe in their own spaces, they start seeing that and put those two together. That's really interesting.
Or go to those people and then ask them what's going on and why they have felt they need to do that. I did that. And people are like, oh, yeah, what's this guy and this guy and this guy? And you're like, okay, well, now I know. I wouldn't have found those guys otherwise, but now I understand what's going on. So
very cool. Well, we're coming up on just a little bit past an hour. There's so much more that we could talk about. The part of your book about neo-Nazi and fascism in music, industrial and black metal especially, struck my fancy because, like I said, I'm very much so in the industrial and black metal scene. The well-known touch points are people like Varg from Burzum, yada yada yada, Boyd Rice. There's so much more.
Read the Varg chapter at the end.
I did. That was yeah. that's some info.
TLDR for listeners, Varg was in direct contact with James Mason via Michael Moynihan. Moynihan gave him a copy of Siege in jail, and then Varg wrote Mason.
Yep, and Varg has not been quiet about his views, especially after getting out of jail. Yep. So, and it's interesting too, because I'm in like some of the black metal subreddits, and every now and again, well, not even every now and again, about every other day, somebody will come up talking about Burzum or something, and you'll have the occasional person in there saying, well, I don't care about his views. He makes good music. I was like, his views are part of his music. So,
it's like people who are like, well, I just like Screwdriver's music, the big Nazi skinhead band. You're like, I'm going to admit, musically, they're not, they're not terrible, but there are 50 other bands that are better than them.
Right.
You do
Absolutely.
not like them because of their music. I mean, Burzum, you may like their music. There are other black metal bands that are just as good and better than Burzum. You are choosing to pick to listen to them.
Yeah.
And I was kind of thinking about this too, especially with like the bands and everything. Like, so let's say a person who may be looking into Satanism, who likes metal, who likes black metal, who likes punk, whatever, they hear all these bands espousing kind of in the Satan sphere, but they're espousing like hard right, neo-Nazi imagery. So somebody is thinking, oh, this is just what Satanism is. So they're going like the music is shaping their opinion of Satanism, and they're just carrying that along, thus making the music kind of be like a virus that's just spreading that to more people, and it's more solidifying itself into the satanic sphere. What would you, does that kind of comport with what you've seen? Like a lot of people who are making these music and having these views, Satanists hear it, and then they're attaching themselves to it because they like it, and then they're comporting those ideas into their Satanism.
Right. Well, there's two things here. One, and this is what we saw in the industrial scene with these guys like Boyd Rice, is that there was so much Nazi imagery used in that scene. No. Now, some of it was like mocking it, some of it was critique, some of it was like a kind of weird fascination, some of it was real adherence, but you couldn't tell who, especially in the 80s. It was before the internet, so you'd get these records and there'd be like a Nazi symbol on it, but you were like, what is it? There'd be no lyric sheet. Maybe it was made in Britain. So, and within that, most of these bands weren't Nazis. And when it came, I found in my research, the people who were exactly who everyone thought they were. It was like Boyd Rice and Michael Moynihan with Adam Parfrey on the side, and Death and June to some extent, this neo-folk band, although lesser than people think, but tied in. And so this, and I talk about this a lot, a cultural scene that uses the imagery and references of a political movement, even if they're not really serious, will allow people in that movement will be attracted to it, and people will see all this stuff and become interested in it. This works in different ways. This worked with anarchism and punk rock. The Sex Pistols were not political anarchists at all, but they put this idea out there, and eventually they did develop real anarchists in the scene, and people became used to anarchist imagery. And I'm sure at some point, people were like, well, what is this? I'd like to learn more about it. Same thing happens with Nazi kind of stuff. And even if 9 people are just using it to be transgressive and scary, like a 10th isn't, and 9 people will affect a bigger pool of people, and some of those will develop a interest in National Socialism to a greater or lesser extent. It can act like a funnel. And this is the second part. It's important to have explicit anti-fascist industrial musicians and black metal musicians in particular. And there are some anti-fascist black metal bands and left-wing bands like RABM, Red and Anarchist Black Metal. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was actually going to bring up our ABM.
Yeah. So, and that's important too, to show that it's what we call a contested terrain. That there is let's just say in a subculture, left and right elements, and they are dueling for influence and even supremacy within it. And it's important to push back, to show that there are people who don't accept it, to show that, everybody just uses Nazi imagery, they're not serious, or blah, blah, blah. To be like, no, it's not okay. Other people who are in our subculture, who are our colleagues in a sense, do not think it's okay. And so this is what we did when we formed this punk anti-fascist group in Atlanta, to just have people be openly, explicitly be like, not just unsettled by it, to be publicly, this is not okay, you should not do this, there are big problems with this, like, this shit needs to get out. Even if you are the minority, but, like, I think that's important, because it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
One of the most important times in my life was an older punk gave me a copy of the Trojan Records sampler, and that's what kind of comported my views on skinhead music. Trojan Records, Jamaican record label, kind of the birthplace of skinhead culture. And it was through that I really kind of deep dived and listened to like what they were bringing out with ska, with dancehall, with reggae. And then you start hearing bands like The Clash kind of, bringing in the dancehall and the reggae as well. Rancid would do the same. And it's something that I do in our group quite often. I try to post a song from the Trojan Record sampler once a month, once every couple of weeks. And I'm like, hey man, some good skinhead music here. Check this shit out. And if you click the link, it does not sound like oi at all. It sounds like reggae. Mm-hmm. And so I've played quite a few from the Trojan Record sampler, and I'm just trying to get that out there, that yes, when you hear, like, not to soften the word skinhead, because I mean it's not going to be, but also to kind of be like, hey man, like, this is also where it came from, more often than not.
Yeah.
The skinhead thing is interesting because it's one of the only subcultures that's a music subculture that has attached itself to different genres at different points in time.
Yeah.
Right. So first from ska and rocksteady into oi, into metal, just metal skins,
yeah.
And other New York hardcore is not oi, and other industrial, there are industrial music skinheads. The other thing, and sort of a side note, recently there's been some, I don't know if they're actual anthologies or just online, counterposing Jamaican reggae and early punk that incorporates it. So, and this becomes very prominent a few years later, not just The Clash, a good example. There's a dub song on the Sex Pistols, right? Submarine?
Yeah.
Mission Boat. It's like a very strongly dub influenced song. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about, like, in the early punk in Britain, they would play dub between the sets. But there are quite a number of punk and post-punk, largely bands from the very early 80s that have that stuff in it, or have songs very influenced by it. It was very interesting to watch them side by side. So I think it's always important to show that these genres, because sometimes fascists will come in and be like, this is a white genre, and to show that they're not, to show a lot of the influences are not, to show a lot of the people, like, you may think these bands are white, but a lot of them aren't.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, Dead Kennedys had a black drummer. And, Polystyrene of the X-Ray Specs, who are one of my favorite bands, like, she's, mixed race background, that a lot of these bands aren't all white. The way the music comes from isn't all white. There was an attempt amongst the neo-Nazis like Tom Metzger and others to claim that oi music was not rock music, because rock music, of course, has its origins in black music, and instead to claim it was purely from British football chants.
Oh, God.
Which you can see the influence, but the real, if you trace oi back, like, the real thing before it is this, like, sort of bubblegum rock.
Yeah.
That comes out right before it, like Slade and stuff, right? And you're like, oh, that's oi, with the heavy drums and everything, right? And chanted vocals, like Sweet and Slade. So you're like, no, not football chants. Like,
fascists, if anything, are good at mental gymnastics.
Right.
They are, yeah. Well, there's like, there's a Nazi dub band that it was from Sweden. Yeah. And in Europe, in Germany in particular, is Nazi hip hop very common. So, but now they can just say it's ironic. I mean, this is the thing. They've gotten beyond the fact of trying to hide what it is. We're just saying it's pragmatic. Now they just hide behind the irony of it.
Yeah. And that is problematic, especially in the industrial scene, because there are so many groups that play around with the gray areas.
Oh.
Like,
no, it just makes it sometimes almost impossible. In the old days, impossible to tell.
Oh yeah,
Nobody
absolutely. You know, my favorite band of all time is KMFDM. So fortunately, they have been very consistent in their left wing politics stance. But recently, I had a kind of a oh fuck moment where there was a guy that they worked with, Tim Skold, back in the early 2000s. Tim Skold also worked with Manson through like the Golden Age of Grotesque era. He has had his own band called Not My God, and Tim Skold, his solo project. I have followed Tim Skold's work for a long time in the industrial electronic music space. And just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, had a photo with Kanye West wearing a Tim Skold piece of merch, and under you could just barely see through the zipper of Tim's jacket what looked like a Nazi eagle on his shirt. That shirt ultimately was traced
Fabulous.
back. Yeah, that shirt was ultimately traced back to a brand called Boy London. So, but even then, plays in that gray area. And when I was reading your book, there was a section that mentioned Triumph of the Will, the 1937 film. Mm-hmm. And there's a song off of one of Skold's albums. The first song of the album is called Triumph of the Will. So I had to really start thinking about my music fandom of Tim Skold a couple of weeks ago, and it kind of hurt, you know.
But I know some people have an unhealthy fascination at best,
yeah.
And who knows how far that goes down.
Yeah.
And then, like, I think one of my favorite was the Misfits. And, you know, Glenn Danzig aside, we'll take him out of the picture entirely. But their second lead singer, Michael Graves, would later become a Proud Boy. And, you know.
Oh, wait, have you seen the T-shirt that Danzig released on his last tour with a big black sun a few months ago?
I have not, no.
Yep.
Wow.
So, mask off for that. I mean, nobody thought Danzig was anything but some right-wing, terrible guy, right? No, but I mean, this is no surprise. But this was like, oh, that guy knows exactly what this stuff is.
And it sucks because, like,
it was a tour T-shirt.
There's the Black Sun shirt, there's the Proud Boy, and now we have Jerry Only, who just sucks. Like there's no iteration of the Misfits that's good. Like, I mean, let alone we're Eagles dare. Like, but the gift of hindsight always kind of kills the Misfits. Before you knew that, hey, great songs, until you hear it, and then you can't unhear it. You can't unring that bell. So yeah, Danzig and Michael Graves can both kick rocks, and Jerry Only just sucks. I don't know.
Well, fortunately, I only like the early 7 inches, so I feel that once I get into the metal thing, the Earth AD, I'm on a big cutoff for me. There.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's just happenstance that I don't like too many Nazis. I mean, I feel blessed that rarely this happens to me. Although there are good, I mean, fascism, just because you're a fascist does not mean you can't create great art. Triumph of the Will, Lenny, I always forget how you say her last name, Riefenstahl, is a great example. But like, there are writers like Celine and Mishima who are like far-right writers. Celine is just a terrible anti-Semitic misogynist, but a brilliant writer.
And that's
Japanese fascist. She's the same. So,
and that's the one thing. Like, for as much as I vehemently hate Varg, I cannot but help to admit that he is a good musician, right? And it sucks that it just has to be Varg, right? So I think we're kind of getting towards the end, and something that we always like to do on our episodes is talk about perhaps a music recommendation, something that you've been kind of into recently. We like to do that. And then after that, if you got any pluggables, as they say, we can do that and sign off. How does that feel?
Sure, but I'm not going to have any kind of recent recommendation. I have to
Oh, it
admit,
doesn't have to
I
be
read
recent at
recently
all.
Punk Rock Fundamentalist. I was like, someone's like, "Oh, I made this set list and it has all these bands." I'm like, "Are there bands after 1983?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Nope, you misunderstand.
Dude,
You misunderstand."
you and I are in the same boat. The show before last, I was referencing a band from the 90s. I was referencing Tad. So, yeah, absolutely. If there's anything you've been
Oh,
jamming out.
Tad! Wow,
Yeah. So
the memories flood back.
So, yeah, Helmet,
So
Tad. I'm one of those guys.
I'm going to recommend something that people largely haven't heard of, especially if you're into rock music, which is there's a whole series of, sometimes they're called the new composers, starting in the 50s and 60s and running into the like 90s. And most famous maybe is John Cage or Philip Glass. They're sort of on both ends of starting and ending. But I like Terry Riley a lot from the early 60s, late 60s and early 70s. It's just drony music, but it doesn't really sound. It's like proto electronic. I mean, using really electronics. And I wrote a lot of the book to it, actually, to Terry Riley. And it's a sort of soothing, driving kind of stuff. I like that. Also, people might want, if you like the Velvet Underground, maybe this is not for you guys. If you like the Velvet Underground, listen to another composer called Lamont Young.
Okay.
And you can hear, and it's a really interesting story to me. Young was into this sort of a 60s, again, composer, into this sort of drony music he took from Indian music. And so it has these, it's not like a Western chord progression. It has these sharp sounds to it. And one of his students was John Cale. And that's why in the Velvet Underground, you hear this wah, like the violins playing this, kind of sharp sound that Cale's known for is from Lamont Young, which is actually from Indian music.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very
So if
interesting.
you like the Velvets, listen to it, and you'll be like, "Oh yeah, I see where that comes from." Right?
I'll give them a listen. That's interesting.
So I've been jamming on this band. It's a new band, female fronted, post grunge. Like I'd spoken to about last show about Rocket with Take Your Aim. There's another band I found called Scowl, SCOWL, and they have a song called Not Heaven Nor Hell, and it once again goes back to those like L7, The Breeders, the female fronted girl, like grunge music that's just really fucking kick ass. They do it very faithfully. And Scowl's been a band that's been on my radar for the past like 2 weeks now. I've been jamming and doing a deep dive on them.
I recently I put it in the Discord music channel and had some reactions about the name, but there's a band called Pupil Slicer.
Yeah.
It's a name. It's a choice.
That's a fucking decision.
But it's like very hard into like the hardcore black. I wouldn't say necessarily black metal. I think they classify themselves as like math metal, mathcore or something like that.
Yeah.
But female fronted, they're out of the UK. Wonderful stuff if you like that sort of thing. Their album Blossom from 2023 was like a fully concept album. It's awesome. So cannot recommend them enough if you're into like the metal scene of things. So
I'm going to recommend one more band. We've been talking about black metal. Unfortunately, it just broke up, but a British band called Dawn Raid. DAWNRAYD, who I've seen, who are really good. I mean, they're like, fucking good black metal band who are explicitly anti-fascist and anarchist.
Nice.
yeah,
like we said, there are anti-fascist black metal bands.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Dawn Raid I like a lot. Just I gave a talk on Nazi Satanism, and I met a friend who I knew online for the first time. He had, again, his zipper just a little bit out, and I was like, "That's a Dawn Raid t-shirt," because I have the same shirt.
Well, Spencer, man, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge. And I guess for the listeners out here, we'll also have these in the show notes. But if you want to plug anything, your books, speaking engagements, where we can follow you, anything like that, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. We talked about my book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism. You can buy it through Routledge, the publisher. If you've got to buy it through Bezos, you can. There may or may not be pirated copies floating around. I said nothing about this. Funny story. Someone actually leaked a PDF of the book 3 weeks before it was published.
Really?
Some crazy stuff like that in publishing. Yeah, I actually heard another person who had a book on Routledge. The book got pulled from publication. There were problems. And later on, years later, someone printed a copy of this book that had been withdrawn before it was published. Someone leaked the PDF and printed it anyway. You can, as we mentioned, 40 Ways to Fight Fascists. It's a short, very practical guide. It's on my website, spencersunshine.com. I have a Patreon. Nobody supports me. I'm not a professor. Don't work at a think tank. And it's Spencer Sunshine. For as little as $2 a month, you can get exclusive content and get a warm and fuzzy feeling of supporting anti-fascist research. And I'm kind of speaking. My speaking tours have been sort of winding down. I am doing talks about my book and about Nazi Satanism. I will be speaking in Richmond, Virginia in a few weeks. I think in 3 weeks from tomorrow. It's not announced, but you can contact me and I'll tell you where it is. And I'm on all the socials, Twitter, Blue Sky I'm most active, Mastodon, Instagram, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. So you can find me pretty easily. I have a YouTube channel. I put content up there occasionally. I made a Boyd Rice video if people are interested in that, going through his history with James Mason. I got all of his letters, so I show his letters. We have video footage. And I wrote an article a few weeks ago for Quietus, the music platform, going through as a brief summary of the countercultural part of the book, if someone doesn't want to read a 450-page book about Rice and Parfrey and Schreck and Moynihan and the others and their involvement with neo-Nazi terrorist doctrines.
Wonderful.
Well, I can't thank you enough because quite literally, like we said at the beginning of the episode, we have been trying to figure out how to do this specific episode for 6-7 months. It was one of the first ideas we had originally when we started the podcast. And Cris and I have just been kind of beating our heads against a wall, trying to figure out the best way to disseminate the information, but also like make it make sense. And having an expert like yourself has definitely helped us out. So from the bottom of my heart, I do appreciate you coming on and sharing your wealth of knowledge.
And I'll echo the same.
I'm more than happy to do this. I mean, I really appreciate you having me on the show. I really want to talk to people who are Satanists and other left-hand path practitioners. So, I sort of learned this as a journalist because I'm used to like doing a lot of research for articles and stuff. And someone was like, just go and ask experts. You don't need to do this stuff. They're the ones who know. So, like reaching out to people who are already fighting back against fascists in your scene. You should reach out to people who know more than you. It's much easier than having to recreate the wheel yourself. But thank you so much for it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. And as fellow Georgians, we can all be together here.
Right
on.
Awesome.
Cris, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so. This was such a great episode. Thank you again. I don't want to echo everything that Jack said, but I do. So I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for being with us.
And
thank you. Ave Satanas.
Hell
there
yes.
you go.
So from all of us here at the Ave Satanas podcast, we're going to have all of Spencer's links in the show notes as well. So you can click those and follow along the very important work that Spencer's doing. But until next time, guys, hail Satan and hail thyself.